Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It is absolutely my pleasure to introduce you to Siobhan Talbott, inaugural lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about Siobhan. So Siobhan completed her master's degree, her MLit and a PhD at the University of St Andrews, and was awarded her PhD in 2010. Her first postdoctoral position was as Economic History Society Tawney Research Fellow at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London from 2010 to 2011. Siobhan then moved to the University of Manchester, first as a research associate in British and Scottish history, and then as a Holdsworth Research Fellow in Political Economy from 2012 to 2014. She was appointed to a lectureship in early modern history at Keele in 2014. And what a remarkable decade it's been. Siobhan's publications comprise 6 books and over 30 research articles and chapters. Her first monograph won the prestigious Senior Hume Brown Prize. Her most recent monograph, which she's going to talk about in her lecture today, is going to be published next month by Oxford University Press. And the title is Knowledge, Information and British Education in the British Atlantic World, 1620 to 1760. Siobhan has won research grants from the AHRC, the ESRC, the British Academy, and most notable being an AHRC Leadership Fellowship in 2018 to 2022, and a very coveted British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship in 22-23. In addition to her own research funding, Siobhan has won 5 externally funded PhD studentships since 2019, including a collaborative doctoral partnership with the British Library, funded by the AHRC, and 4 case studentships awarded by the ESRC. Siobhan fulfills a number of external roles, including as co-editor of the Royal Historical Society's Camden series. That's all the accomplishments that are in writing that are amazing and reflect this fantastic 10-year career that Siobhan's had at Keele and before then. But I do want to say that Siobhan is an amazing colleague, and your friends and family are here to celebrate your career. But Siobhan leads by example. She leads the education for the school. She's the school director of education. She ably led a very, very time-consuming curriculum review in about 6 weeks, reviewing all of our programs, renewing our curriculum on that. She mentors colleagues, gives up all of her time, her spare time, very willingly to colleagues. She's a great leader by example and a great member of this school, this faculty and this university. So we're here to celebrate that as well and to thank Siobhan for her contribution. Having said all of that, I'm just going to now pass over to Siobhan, who will discuss her most recent work in this inaugural lecture. So thank you, Siobhan.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Donna, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everybody here and online for coming to listen to me speak this evening. Donna mentioned my new book in her introduction, and what I'm going to speak about this evening is part of that new book. I really wanted to be able to wave a copy of it at you, but it hasn't quite managed to arrive yet. It's still a couple of weeks away. But I do have a picture of it, which you can see on the PowerPoint, and this is the contents list of the book. The book explores how early modern merchants and other types of commercial agents gathered knowledge, created, circulated and used information, and became educated in many aspects of business. And the reason that it evolved in this way is because several years ago I realised that all the work that I'd done to that point in my career had looked at merchants' activities and the impact of these activities. So, for example, I'd done a lot of research exploring the way that international trade was conducted during periods of war. I looked at how merchants navigated and contributed to economic policies and sanctions during these conflicts. But I'd never really explored why merchants acted in the ways that they did. And this led me to have several questions. So how did merchants learn to be merchants? What informed their decision-making processes? What information did they rely on to make informed decisions about their business? And when I started to look for answers to these questions, I discovered that they didn't really seem to be questions that historians were widely asking. So I've attempted to answer them myself, and this book is the result of that. I obviously don't have time to discuss all aspects of the book this evening, so I'm going to talk about one central theme, which is education. But there are some overarching conclusions of the book that it might be helpful for you to know before I narrow down this focus. One of the central contributions of the book is to debates about the existence or not of an early modern print revolution. This is a well-known and vociferously debated concept in early modern studies. And there's a real split in scholarship on this topic between scholars who maintain that the invention and spread of print was revolutionary in terms of how ideas and information circulated, and those that acknowledge the importance of print, but also recognise that continued oral and manuscript circulation of information remained essential. And as a spoiler, I'm in the second of those camps. So I argue throughout the book that manuscript exchange of information not only remained essential, but that it was prioritised over print by the commercial agents that I investigate. And this is despite the undeniable increasing availability of this print. I also argue that the increase in the volume of available information in print wasn't necessarily positive, that this led to conflicting data and issues of trust, and that it presented as many challenges as it did benefits for users of this information. I suggest in the book that the emphatic attention that has been given to print has obscured the continued importance of manuscripts in spreading knowledge, information, and education. And it should be said that I found that this pattern is particularly evident among historians. I think literary scholars have been much better at recognising the continued importance of manuscript forms of communication and information exchange, which just serves to highlight the importance of talking to colleagues outside our own discipline. I've got much better at that throughout the course of writing this book, and I think the book's much stronger for it. This central argument in the book about the relative importance of print and manuscript has had a significant bearing on the methodologies that I've used and the approaches that I've taken to this project. So I'm going to say a little bit about that before I move on to the main content of my lecture this evening. Focus on the rise of print, so on the print revolution that I mentioned a moment ago, has meant that printed conduits for news and information have often been placed at the centre of debates about early modern knowledge and education. And this work has been really important. It's enhanced our understanding of early print. It's enhanced our understanding of genres like printed news and the rise of the printed newspaper. But it's also meant that the continued importance of manuscript forms of knowledge exchange have largely been, and I would argue this has been quite significant, overlooked. So I've specifically made manuscript materials a focus of this project. The types of manuscripts that I've used are really varied. They include things like merchants' letters, ships' logs, account books, journals, maybe most significantly for today's, for this evening's focus, educational materials like exercise books, arithmetic books, manuscript dictionaries and glossaries, and I'm going to show you some examples of these materials during the lecture. But the nature of this research has meant that there isn't a core corpus of archival material that underpins the project. The manuscripts that I've used are housed in disparate collections across Britain, Europe and North America. They're frequently, as you'll see tonight, miscatalogued, which has made finding them all the more fun. This somewhat scattergun approach that I've taken to this research has been driven in some ways by necessity, but there are also benefits to it. So in bringing disparate materials from many different contexts together, it's possible to identify trends in knowledge production and exchange that were not confined by political, geographical or temporal boundaries. And it's also been possible to identify continuities and coherences across a large geographical area and a long chronology. And this broad approach, I argue, reflects the realities of merchant activity in this period. They took place within an expanding and increasingly transoceanic international commercial and professional sphere. And this was a world for these merchants that transcended political borders or political events. So the moments that we as historians often see as crucial were often far from crucial in the eyes of the contemporaries that I study. So for the merchants that I examine, important moments in print history, such as the publication of the first English Coranto in 1621, the explosion in printed advice books in the late 17th century, I'm going to talk a little bit about those this evening, or the proliferation of financial newspapers in the 18th century, had very little immediate impact on their methods of knowledge gathering. Although the merchants that I examine operated in a number of different cultures, a number of different social contexts, one of my core arguments in the book is that changes in politics and society, including printing, did not so radically change the ways that business information was created or circulated or used. And this very much develops an argument that I've made throughout my career, including in earlier work, that it's necessary to place a distance between the activities of people, so in my case, these merchants, and the broader political context in which they were operating. This isn't to suggest that national boundaries or cultural differences didn't matter, but that seemingly important events such as wars, unions, coronations, regicide were not at the forefront of merchants' day-to-day concerns. So, having explained what the book as a whole looks like and what its core purpose is, what the approach is that underpins it, I'm going to focus tonight on one theme of the book, which is education. And the reason that I've chosen this is for a few reasons. One, I think, is probably a bit sentimental. It was the first element of this project that I worked on. About a decade ago, I started thinking about some of these questions. And it was the theme that got me into many of the broader themes that the book also looks at. I'd initially written an article on commercial education, but when I sent it to colleagues to read, they said that it read more like a chapter of a bigger book. So I thought I'd better write the rest of the book before I published that chapter. I've also chosen this theme because this is a faculty event, and I thought this topic would speak to broader interests across the faculty, not just to my fellow historians. And finally, it's the chapter with the best images. So I've got some pretty things for you to look at as well. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this evening is taken from chapter 3 of the book. This chapter looks at how both established and aspiring merchants acquired commercial skill. So this includes things like abilities in foreign languages, knowledge of commercial jargon, mathematics, navigation. And the chapter is underpinned by two core questions. What did merchants need to learn? And how did they acquire the skills and the methods that they needed to be successful? Another big book spoiler here. So I argue throughout the book, and I'll say this again later on this evening, that we shouldn't view early modern commercial agents as a homogenous group. They were individuals with different ambitions, with different aims, and they were operating in very different contexts. So the education that they sought and the ways that they acquired this education also varied hugely. And unsurprisingly, bearing in mind what I've said so far, I argue in this chapter that the print revolution did not foster a fundamental shift from manuscript and oral learning to text-based learning. So the rest of my lecture this evening is split roughly into two parts. The first explores the ways that merchants acquired technical knowledge. So I'm going to talk about how merchants learned the jargon that they needed to know, how they developed mathematical skills, how they learned more complex navigational skills. And then in the second part, I'm going to turn towards the more practical side of knowledge acquisition. I'm going to ask some questions about how we have and should categorise educational materials. And I'm going to do this tonight through looking at ship's logs and the development of meteorological knowledge. Some elements of the second part of the lecture are even newer than the book that hasn't quite made it into print yet. So I'm currently working on further developing some of these ideas about how merchants contributed to broader meteorological developments and knowledge gathering. It's well understood that business in the early modern period was a skilled profession, and there's been quite a bit of scholarship looking at some aspects of how merchants learned about business. This scholarship has primarily looked at two things: apprenticeships and printed advice manuals. And this work has taught us a lot about the rise in formal commercial education in this period, about the role of printed materials in increasing opportunities for learning. But it's also led inadvertently to an imbalance in our understandings of how merchants learned. Printed material could and did play a role in commercial learning, but intense focus on it has meant that we know less about its limitations and much less about the wide variety of other ways in which merchants trained for business. When we think of education, we tend to think of classrooms and teachers and books. And in the early modern period, commercial education did begin to take place in formal settings. So there was a growth of mercantile schools in Europe, later in Britain, and they taught skills like double entry bookkeeping, geometry, astronomy, surveying, navigation. There was also a huge increase in the production of printed business manuals. So the early modern period has been described as the first great age of the textbook. It's been estimated that between the late 15th and early 19th centuries, about 12,000 business manuals were published across Europe. And this is one example of one of those. This is Edward Hatton's Merchant's Magazine. This was marketed as being accommodated chiefly to the practice of merchants and tradesmen. It contained advice on arithmetic, on keeping accounts, on bookkeeping, bills of exchange, how to use factors and brokers, and letters of credit. And texts like these are frequently described as educational. And from this description and from the content, you can see why this is the case. But there's little evidence that these texts were widely used by merchants for practical instruction. They were often large, heavy, expensive texts. They weren't necessarily affordable, and they weren't portable. And this pattern is mirrored in other types of printed advice books too, including things like law handbooks, which I talk about in chapter 4 of the book. In addition, while the advice contained in these books wasn't largely problematic, it tended to be vague and often out of date. So I'll give an example of each of these issues. So in chapter 4 of The Merchant's Map of Commerce, Lewis Roberts provided information on how rates of customs differed between different commodities, but he's not very specific. So he says that some commodities are higher rated in the customs than others. Some pay the rate of 5%, some 10, some 15, some 20, some more, some less, but gives no details of what these commodities were or which might be higher rated. Secondly, when these volumes were reprinted, they weren't updated. So the examples shown here, taken from editions of the Merchant's Map printed in 1638 and 1677, give lists of exchange rates, and these lists are identical in these two publications, but of course exchange rates changed over time. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of this is surprising. These were expensive publications, they needed to have longevity, but it did mean that these volumes were of limited, immediate, practical educational use. So the information might be indicative, but it's not practically useful on a day-to-day basis for merchants conducting business. Profession-specific literacy or jargon was important, and there was a host of technical language that merchants needed to understand. So printed glossaries or dictionaries in advice manuals explained, in this case, the most difficult terms commonly used in merchandise and trade. But again, these were only useful to those who could access these texts, and again, they weren't portable. So merchants created and maintained their own manuscript glossaries, prioritising the terms that were most useful to their own business needs. And these were designed to be added to be updated, and importantly, to be carried around. So the example here is from an early 18th century Providence merchant. It includes explanations of a wide range of terms, including things like accounts, bills of exchange, debt and piracy. And you can see that gaps have been left for additional entries. So this was something that was very much intended to be added to over time. There were also places in the volume where additional information or additional entries are squashed in because they've been added at a later date and the gap hasn't been left for them. So this was a fluid document. It was honed by individuals. It was geared towards those individuals' own particular needs and interests. So this particular example included a lot of legal terms. So things like libel, letters of attorney, verdict, witnesses, evidence, defamation. So there's an indication here that this particular merchant, Nathaniel Newdigate, wanted or needed to particularly understand the law, which isn't a theme in other manuscript glossaries that I've seen. I talk about Newdigate a bit more in chapter 4 when I discuss the ways that merchants acquired legal knowledge. So I've talked a little bit there about skills in literacy, but it's probably obvious that merchants also needed skills in numeracy. And merchants practice these mathematical skills in manuscript arithmetic books, with the level and type of skill represented in these volumes differing, depending on merchants' priorities, depending on the context in which this information was learned. Some aspects of these texts were quite formulaic. So most of these examples include basic arithmetic and algebra, but they were also very individual texts. So the two examples here provide quite interesting comparison. So the first example on the upper left of the slide is the arithmetic book of Isaac Watts. He's best known for imprisonment for nonconformity and for being the father of his more well-known scholarly son. But he was also a clothier, which is why I'm interested in him. And this volume dates from 1664. And the other belonged to Thomas Massey. This dates from 1720. And you can see, I think at first glance, that these are quite different volumes. They're roughly the same size. They both include some common information, but Watts's book is more specifically geared towards theoretical commercial education. So he includes instruction on English, French and Spanish money, weights and measures, bartering and exchange. Quite unusually for an arithmetic book, he includes sections on company or fellowship, suggesting that working in partnerships was something specifically taught. So one of the exercises that Watts solves in his book is a problem outlining an agreement for a voyage made between four parties who would all put in different proportions of money. So the problem asks what share the freighter had, what share the ship had, what share each man had. It's a problem that's pretty unspecific. So the volume is more concerned with mathematical skill and theoretical knowledge than practical application. And the solutions that accompany these problems very much have the air of being copied down in a formal education environment rather than being worked out individually by the author. This, as well as the fact that the volume is neatly written, it's very decorative, probably suggests that it was created in a formal learning environment. It was probably intended for future reference. So Watts was young, he was only 14 when this was produced. Massey's exercise book is much more haphazard. It was used by him primarily to practice questions and sums rather than to record tidy explanations of theory. It also includes a range of commercial problems, but in this case, the problems are a bit more specific and seem more concerned with practical application. So the example that I've put on the slide, a merchant consigns to his factor 288 cloths with commission for sale at 15 shillings per L English, and to have returned the one half in sugar at 7 shillings per piece, the other half in wine at £12 per tonne. How much of each must be returned? And you can see here that Massey is working out the answer to the problem, but in a practical way understandable to him, rather than setting it out as a formal solution, like Watts does. So Massey's priority seems to have been more the acquisition of applicable skills essential to his business, and the desire to be able to perform these calculations himself, rather than the more showy theoretical education that we see in Watts's volume. A basic grasp of mathematics underpinned any mercantile role, but some merchants also needed to acquire practical skills, including in navigation. So the same individual approach to learning that we see in these arithmetic books is also apparent in navigation books, with some merchants prioritising the understanding of theoretical underpinning of skill and others being more interested in practical application. So James Brown, a merchant in 18th century Providence, kept an arithmetic book that had notes on geometry and trigonometry, as well as specific glossaries. So this is one on plain sailing definitions. In a second separate manuscript book, Brown applied this theoretical knowledge to practical examples. So questions like, I demand the direct course, distance and departure from Rhode Island to Barbados. There's a series of various questions in navigation, followed by careful calculations made by Brown. As with arithmetic books, there were some elements common to many navigation books. So the mariner's compass, used to learn the theory of using navigational instruments when on board a vessel, frequently appears, and this is one example from a New York merchant's ledger. But again, comparison of these volumes reveals individual preferences. So James Brown's son, also helpfully called James Brown, kept a navigation book similar to that of his father, but with additional information. This includes a dictionary of definitions, including things like equator, globe, meridian. And in addition to the more common elements, like the mariner's compass that I showed a moment ago, Stephen Richard added a section to his navigation book on using the Julian calendar, so the old-style dating system, useful because different places switched dating systems at different times, and merchants commonly used both systems in letters to avoid any confusion. But this is something that I haven't seen in other navigation books that I've looked at. Further, Richard learns about moon cycles and tides. He notes how currents impacted sailing. And again, currents don't really feature in other surviving navigation books of this type that I've looked at. But Richard completes a whole set of problems just on this theme. So these comparisons suggest that beyond a baseline of knowledge, each merchant prioritised the specific training that would be most useful to them. And importantly, this is something that's only evident from comparing the manuscript volumes. The types of large printed advice books that I started the lecture with don't make this clear. And they are aimed at broad audiences. They give the impression that commercial knowledge was homogeneous. And this is one of the core reasons that I argue in the book that going back to the manuscripts is essential. So some work has taken printed texts, like the advice manuals that I showed earlier, and extrapolated from these that is the knowledge that merchants desired and needed, and that they could all access this from these printed texts. But when we look at the records that were kept by merchants themselves, we are told instead that education was acquired in a range of ways, and that the knowledge that merchants prioritised was personal and was individualised. This is evident further from a broader examination of merchants' records. This is the subject of chapter 5 of the book, and I'm just going to take a moment for a brief aside on this here. There have only been a few previous analyses of merchants' record-keeping practices, But those that do exist have assumed that merchants' information fit into clear categories and was stored in specific volumes. So the advice books that I mentioned at the start of the lecture advocated keeping business records in particular ways. So Edward Hatton, for example, advocated 3 books necessary for keeping accounts: a waste book, a journal, and a ledger. And this has led to the conclusion that this was how merchants kept their records. But examination of the records themselves, the manuscript records themselves, shows that this wasn't the case. Whether because, as I've already suggested, these texts weren't universally accessible and so merchants didn't know this is what they were supposed to be doing, or whether because merchants were individuals who kept records in individual ways according to their own practices and aims, and it's probably a little bit of both of those things. So in the case of record keeping too, as well as in the case of education specifically, reliance on printed evidence leaves us with an incomplete view of early modern business practices. The examples that I've just looked at in the first part of the lecture are mostly concerned with theoretical learning, and perhaps with how this theoretical learning might translate to practical events. But once they were active, merchants didn't stop producing manuscripts that documented and assisted their commercial education. So the manuscripts that I've talked about so far tonight were obviously intended to be educative, but the sources that I'm going to talk about now had another primary purpose. I think it's not always obvious what types of sources should be categorised as educational, and this is part of a broader argument in the book that the way that we as historians categorise educational texts needs to be rethought and expanded, certainly in the commercial sphere, but I suspect in thinking about education as a broader theme as well. So I'm going to address this tonight through one of the themes that this chapter considers, which is the impact of weather and climate on merchant activities. So I ask in the chapter how merchants became aware of the potential impact that different types of weather, both ordinary and extraordinary, could have on business, and particularly how they learned methods by which this might be handled or mitigated. We know that in the late 17th century there were big strides in weather-related knowledge gathering. There's been some wonderful recent work that's explored things like historical weather forecasting. But the importance of this knowledge to those in business specifically isn't explicitly explored in that work. So there's still a lot that we don't understand about the intersection of weather forecasting and of commercial activity and knowledge, despite the obvious ways that weather impacted commercial activity. So merchants' letters are littered with references to all kinds of weather, both everyday and extraordinary, and the ways that this weather impacted their business. I've already talked tonight about printed advice books, and there were also an increasing number of other types of printed texts, providing ever more information on many different themes. And one of these were almanacs, providing long-term weather forecasts. And these were so popular that they've been described as a staple of the early printing presses. So I'll just show you a few examples. So these included Thomas Buckminster's 1598 Almanac and Prognostication, which claimed to offer a daily disposition of the weather. William Woodhouse's An Almanac and Prognostication. This was specified as being chiefly for gentlemen, lawyers, merchants, mariners, husbandmen, travellers, and all other. And as the period progressed, an increasing number of printed texts circulated knowledge about ocean going. So William Bullock's Virginia Impartially Examined discussed different routes to the Chesapeake. William Dampier's A Discourse of Trade Winds was translated into both French and Dutch, which speaks to its reach, its popularity. The more general merchant advice books, the printed books that I mentioned earlier, give very little information about weather, winds, or oceanic navigation. So Lewis Roberts' Merchant Map only notes that the lading of the goods aboard must be done in fair and dry weather and at fit seasons, which is pretty much a common sense statement. It's not really enough information on which to base specific decisions. So as I noted earlier, these printed texts were of relatively limited practical and immediate educational use. This was no different when it came to education about the weather or about navigation. So merchants needed to learn about the weather through different avenues. And one of the types of manuscript that contributed to this knowledge, but which is not immediately obvious as a type of educational text, were ships' logs. So ships' masters kept manuscript logs when on voyages that were used to record these specific voyages. These are distinct from the navigation books that I showed earlier because they were taken on board vessels, they were dedicated to the recording of journeys. They don't contain focused navigational calculations or practice problems. Instead, they record observations of routes sailed or places visited or the weather that was encountered. So in many ways, they are the practical manifestation of the theory that we see in these navigation books. But I argue that whatever their primary function, they were educational texts. These were manuscripts that were used to advance knowledge and to advance understanding. They were used to influence future business decisions, which is the context in which I'm most interested in them. So I argue in the book that ships' logs were not merely records. They were kept so that they could be referred to when future journeys were taken in the same seas. They acted as educative texts either for the same merchant or mariner undertaking a repeat voyage or for their sons, associates, business partners. So this is a ship's logbook kept by the Fife merchant Alexander Gillespie in the 1660s and 1670s. And throughout his logbook, Gillespie details his experiences of sailing in various waters, navigating in and out of various ports in Northern Europe. And this entry is a particularly nice one because Gillespie accompanies it with a drawing of what a mariner would see when approaching this port from a particular direction. And many of Gillespie's entries are written in a style that makes it clear that they were intended to be read by others and therefore, I argue, to be used for educative purposes. So when Gillespie sailed from Shetland in 1668, he wrote a passage instructing others how to navigate Shetland's waters. So he writes, "When you come from the north, for land coming to the northwards, you must, if you have a flood, steer northeast, for the flood falleth in southwest westerly. When you are in the fairway, you shall have 14, 13, also 15 fathoms water, but if you have an ebb, you may keep more northerly, to say northeast, and you will be past the said nap, a good way to the northward of it." And this kind of direct nautical education could not be fully realised through theoretical learning or using printed texts. There were aspects of navigational understanding that had to be acquired in practice. So Gillespie only learned the best ways to navigate Europe's waters by doing it himself, and he recorded and passed on this knowledge so that future merchants could learn from his experience. It's worth just noting that by the mid-18th century, logbooks had become much more formulaic. So Gillespie's is largely, with the exception of a couple of drawings, written in prose. But this 18th century New England example uses a more tabular form to record dates, locations, wind direction, distance travelled. But it served the same purpose and had the same onward educative role. Importantly, independent logbooks like Gillespie's are one of the earliest examples of particular types of weather recording. So a lot of the research that's been undertaken on ships' logs has focused on those created within institutions, so such as those kept by the Royal Navy and the English East India Company. But the recording of weather conditions such as wind direction in independent ships' logs predates the earliest institutional examples. So I'll give one example of this. So in September 1667, more than a decade before the first example of this type of record in one of those institutional ships' logs, Gillespie noted that the 27th we came over to Burnt Island Road, the wind north-northeast, Upon the 30th of this foresaid, we came to Yarmouth Road, it being a stormy wind at west-northwest. And throughout his log, Gillespie frequently uses compass point notations to describe winds. So the example on the PowerPoint is from June 1675, when he noted that Wednesday in the morning we weighed the wind, then west-southwest and fair weather. We was put in again the wind west-northwest and great rains. So these manuscript records are a treasure trove of information about the weather, but more importantly for me, they demonstrate another avenue through which merchants acquired education in commercial matters. They were circulating sophisticated knowledge about weather and climate, and they contributed to others' understandings of how to navigate in particular waters and through particular types of weather. But in addition to being important to individual merchants' knowledge and education, the knowledge that was amassed in these manuscripts made significant contributions to broader developments in understanding the weather, climate, winds, and oceanic travel. So this might be familiar to some of you. This is Edmund Halley's renowned 1686 map of trade winds. This has been credited with directly improving techniques of oceanic navigation. In compiling his map, Halley collected observations about ocean winds from mariners, from his own seafaring experience, and importantly, from ships' logs directly. So the nautical practice of diligently recording wind speeds and direction in manuscript form in ships' logs directly contributed to the development of important meteorological knowledge and practices and the spread of knowledge surrounding these practices. The mathematician Isaac Greenwood noted in 1728, following a voyage that he took between Boston and London, that ships' logs contained a general account of the weather for every day during the passage of the ship on the voyage, which is a far more exact register of the direction of the winds than was ever kept ashore, being an account thereof to every 2 hours in the day. As for the degree or strength of the wind, there are also sufficient data in all sea journals to determine it. Lastly, there's a daily account inserted of the latitude and longitude of the ship. And Greenwood specifically noted the value of this knowledge as education for future voyages. So he says, were we able to define the more frequent and reigning winds of every climate, the probability of voyages might then be calculated in the same manner as that of other chances. So the sailor might then better know how to order his course so as to arrive with the most probable dispatch to his port. And I think this speaks really nicely both to the educative capabilities of these kinds of manuscript, and it highlights the important contribution made by merchants to the development of broader knowledge and understanding. So importantly, and another underlying theme of the book, merchants were not merely the recipients of education access through printed text like advice books and almanacs. They were themselves crucial to the gathering and sharing of knowledge, including about the weather, wind, and climate. So I'm going to offer a few words of conclusion before I finish. We can see that methods of learning remained highly practical for merchants and mariners, despite the explosion in printed text that we know happened in this period. In 1626, Captain John Smith made his feelings about learning from books as opposed to experience clear. He states multiple times the importance of experience over academic learning. In discussing shipbuilding, he noted that nothing but experience can possibly teach it, and that experiences must be the best tutor. When discussing learning to be a ship's gunner, he wrote that no certain artificial rules be prescribed, you must learn it by practice. And in relation to navigation, he wrote that to learn to observe the altitude, latitude, longitude, amplitude, the variation of the compass, and to know the tides, get some of those books, but practice is the best. Now, it's probably inappropriate that my last image is of a printed text, because the continued importance of manuscript materials to merchants' education is an argument that underpins the whole of my new book. In the context of merchants' education, I argue that the significance of continued manuscript transmission of commercial knowledge has been underexplored, despite it remaining essential for merchants' education. I also suggest, as I mentioned earlier, that we need to broaden the types of material that we class as educative in this period. Manuscripts like ship's logs are not obviously educational texts, but they were used in an educational way. And crucially, the expansion of printed materials didn't, for most, supplant the more practical education gained from experience, or the knowledge recorded in or gained from these types of manuscripts. I noted in the introduction to this lecture that merchants are too rarely discussed as individuals with personal stories and circumstances. But merchants' education was focused on what they needed to learn for their particular business or circumstance. So those who wished to act as ship's masters needed skills in navigation and language, and those who stayed at home and acted through local factors would have less need for these skills, but perhaps more need for accounting and bookkeeping knowledge. So business education was a very individualised experience. And we can only see that as historians through prioritising the manuscript material that they produced. It's not evident through only examining printed materials. So I hope that what I've selected to talk about this evening is a good indication of some of the themes that the book explores, kind of showcases some of the materials that I've been using over the last few years. I would obviously have loved to have talked about more aspects of the book, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Thank you very much.